Welcome, everybody. My name is Christian Talbot. I am the president of the Middle States Association, and I am thrilled to be joined here today by two good friends, Aaron Shorn, who is the director of community and growth at Unrulr, and Gary Heidt, who is an English and social entrepreneurship teacher at a public school in Pennsylvania. And we are here to talk about a specific educational technology product called Unrulr, but really, more importantly, we're here to talk about what it looks like when teachers can completely level up their practice from ways that are very mechanistic and kind of low fidelity to ways that are transformational, deeply human, that manage to accomplish all of the tasks and the responsibilities that a teacher has when it comes to curriculum and assessment, but also that go way beyond in unlocking the individual and the communal potential of young people on behalf of our common good. So I'm excited to dig into this conversation with them. Well, I am very glad to be here with you, Gary and Aaron, to talk about Unrulr and the ways in which we can transform the learning experience and the documentation of that learning experience. And this is part of a much bigger conversation for us at Middle States, because we've spent most of this past year thinking about this network for Middle States, which is an organization that is all over the world. We're in 118 countries, over 2,800 schools. And wow. On one hand, what that means is there's just an incredible diversity in our network. On the other hand, I know from my many years in the classroom, and I know you know from your collective years in the classroom, that when it gets down to great learning experiences, there are some things that are just universal and common. And I'm super impressed with Unrulr and the way that you're using it. So let's start with you, Gary, and just tell us a little bit about what Unrulr is for you.
I'd say Unrulr is an app, but that just cuts it so short. I think Unrulr creates a space within the classroom that is, while it is a virtual space, I think it's more real than most virtual spaces. And because it allows students to not only document through images and video and audio their learning experiences and their learning journeys, but then to share that with other students. And that creates, points along a learning journey or their growth chart, if you will, if you want to go to a, pediatric metaphor. And along those points, they can, they're documenting where they are, and they're sharing that with other people, and they're getting feedback. And so that space grows from just an academic space into a community space. And those points become sort of like chapters in a larger story. And we all know that stories are amazing, and they create communities around them. So the power of storytelling is, I think, what Unrulr captures, and it's this beautiful community space that I've used this past year and played around with, and which has elevated my students' ability to really understand what learning might mean.
And Gary, just as a follow-up, do you use it as a replacement for something that you used to use, or is this something that you would never be able to use if Unrulr didn't exist? But once you stumbled on it, you thought, okay, I'm gonna now bring this into my space.
Yeah, so I think it's both. I have always in my classes used some sort of project-based learning, or if they're writing essays, and when I'm teaching in my English classes, we're collecting those artifacts, and I always ask my students to comment on those artifacts, to write what's called a process piece. Like, here's what I did, here's why I did it, here's where I succeeded, and here's where I think I need some work. And then if time allowed, I would have time for them to share those pieces with each other. But time is the dirtiest word in all of education, I think, because if you ask teachers what they need, they're always going to say we need more time, and if you ask students what they need, I need more time to do this, and it's so. Um, but Unruler helps. Um, I don't want to say it compresses time, but it helps us use time more wisely, and it helps us. It helps break down the barriers between classes, right? Like I can instead of having to like schedule time where all three of my classes meet together somehow, or I have to like take the documents from one class and physically port them to another class. I can just create a classroom on Unruler that's like a united classroom for all three of my English classes or whatever classes they may be, and everybody's in that space and everyone's seeing everyone else's work and commenting on it. So, um, does it replace things? Uh, Not quite. It does augment things that I was already doing, and I think it does things in a better way.
So, full time classroom teacher, you were always trying to document process
Yeah.
and portfolios of artifacts, and Unruler allows you to do that more easily, more beautifully. It also creates a kind of seamless community experience as well. Um, I think that to me is the feature set that most jumps out. But Aaron, you work for Unruler, so tell us what Gary and I have failed to articulate about the beauty of this tool.
I work for Unruler, but I used it first as a teacher, as a
Yeah.
K-12 capstone coordinator, and though it was not as good as Gary, Gary's a kindred spirit. I was
Yeah.
embarking on documentation and evidence of learning being rooted in the learner, and Unruler was both a portfolio tool for learners to document not just their product but their process and their reflections. A catalog, right? Like how we ask a student to annotate in a book for English. Unruler was an annotation tool for
Yeah.
projects and also for identity and for reflection. But it was this communal learning tool, right? That Ron Berger idea of artifacts of excellence, right? Where other learners through Unruler, through their documentation, through their reflection, were showing other learners this process and building confidence and belonging. And so I think it's both a tool for individuals to build portfolios, but it's also a communal space like Gary's students are using it to comment, to engage, to see what learners are doing in really wonderful ways. I mean, the tagline on our website, Unruler is a social learning app that makes holistic growth visible through authentic moments. It's a bunch of buzzwords. They mean something to me, right? But that could be anything. I think Unruler is really a conduit, a vehicle, an amplifying tool to the magic that's happening in your classrooms. And as a way to make process visible, as a way to make the iterations of really cool products visible too.
I want to come back to that word social that you used just in just a moment. But maybe each of you can just describe a really simple scenario in which you would use this or are using this in the classroom, and just tell us like what's the beginning, the middle, and the end of, Gary, you said could be a project-based learning experience, it could be writing an essay, it could be 10 million other things. Just for people who are going to watch this or listen to this, what would a beginning, middle, end of using Unruler for a learning experience look and feel like?
Sure. So, one of the units that I used it with in my English class was based on a study of the concept of carpe diem. Typical 10th grade unit, it's about identity formation and how we spend our time and whatnot. And students had open choice at the end of, I mean, there were like 8 suggestions where they could come up with their own project. And they all had to meet certain criteria and discuss certain concepts like identity, time, decision making, and things. Um, and what I had the students do is whatever project they were working on, and you used beginning, middle, and end, right? So, I mean, that was just real easy. What's first Unruler post was, okay, what is it you're choosing to do and why did you choose that? And where are you in your brainstorming or your formulation process? And then maybe a couple days later, whenever they felt they were ready for it, here's the middle. Here's where I am in the middle. I'm going to get feedback on this, and that's the purpose of this post. Here's where I am right now. Who can give me feedback on this? And how can I learn from what you're seeing as to how I'm communicating, whether it's visually, auditorily, or in a written sense? And then the final product, final is that's the last post, right? The end is, here's what I've come up with, and what do you guys think of this? And then I had them not only write sort of like a little process piece, so that was a journey prompt is what I created there. But I also had them comment on at least three other people's, and that was in a joint class. So I had two classes of gifted English students and one class of regular college prep English in my public school. And all three of those classes were mixing together and commenting on things and watching things and just really enjoying the process of being able to see what other people were doing and learn from them.
That's great.
I mean, I'll give you a micro and a macro. Micro, Cary School, North Carolina, Cary Academy rather. And, 2 weeks of usage, almost 1,500 posts, but it was the quality of the posts that was remarkable. And it was the engagement between learners that was remarkable. And they were, for 2 weeks, students either choose to do student-led projects around the theme of choosing, whether it's AI in education, whether it's baking, whether it's business, or half of the cohort can do work experience, internships across the Raleigh-Durham, Cary area. And it was remarkable to see evidence of the remarkable, incredible things students were doing. But it was the video reflections that were the most powerful, that were evidence of metacognition, of critical thinking, of unpacking an experience, these exit ticket audio and video reflections. And then students jumping into the posts of others and asking questions, creating these threads of inquiry that then went back into the classroom, right, that were really powerful. And that was a really quick 2-week usage of Unrulr. In the beginning, students were talking about who they are and what they're interested in, that kind of identity, humans of New York way of using our tool. In the middle, it was getting comfortable sharing, both for a teacher and for others. And you saw that dip, right, into performative posting to authentic posting. And then by the end, there were these journeys that encapsulated an experience, interconnected posts that were timelined and told a wider story. In my own usage, and as I see it in year-long capstones, in entrepreneurship classes, in culminating experiences that we often see in schools, it was this incredible documentation of ideation, research, project management, product development, presentation. It was a tool that allowed learners to be able to showcase the life cycle of a project that they were working on. And we... Gary's heard me say this 1,000 times. We always start with human connection in Unrulr. Mm-hmm. Usually we tell schools and nonprofits and communities that are using Unrulr, ask a question that's similar to who are you and what fuels you to your learners, and get multimodal responses. This is what Angela Stockman talks a lot about at Damon University. The power of letting a learner choose video, photo, audio, writing, or all converged into one. And that becomes the starting place of the usage of the tool. And then they feel more comfortable sharing out the iterations of the work that they're doing. We've seen the tool try to chip away at the perfectionist nature of many independent schools and many public schools, where learners only get work out into the world that's perfect. And there's such a joy when you get imperfect work out there and you get feedback on it. And our theory of change is that when there's evidence that can be seen by others, then we're more likely to kind of document and understand it too.
Yeah, I want to pull on that thread a little bit because there are a few things that first stood out to me about the product, Aaron, when you introduced me to it. And I think the first thing I realized about it is this question around identity. And both of you know that for many years now, I've been preoccupied with, I guess it's a point of view rather than a realities, but my very strong point of view is that the most important questions that we can allow students to explore are, who am I? Who are we? What matters to us? And what are we going to do about it? And if those are hooks onto which we can hang our learning, or if those are maybe like kind of categories of Lego pieces that we can combine and recombine into all sorts of new and beautiful creations, then we're really preparing students for a lifetime of learning in community for impact. So I would love to hear each of you talk a little bit about the social dimension of Unrulr. Just as a baseline, I could imagine it being very powerful if only the student user themselves had access to it. But when a student posts, they have the opportunity to turn things on or off, visible or invisible. And a chunk of what drives the experience, it seems to me, is making visible to others what you're doing. So talk a little bit about what that's like and why it's so important.
Well, so I know Aaron was really jazzed about this first activity I did with it was the very first thing I did with Unrulr.
Biggest understatement of the year.
uh, so I used to do this. I used to have kids by hand. We would do silhouettes of their head, right? So this is back in the day when I had access to, let's say, 15 overhead projectors that I could corral into my classroom. And we would project just a basic light onto a wall. We put paper up, and then a partner would do a silhouette of somebody else. And then they would have time to visually answer the question, how do I think? Right. And so you would have some students would do very organic inside their head. Things would be kind of like growing, and other students would do very more mechanical, linear type thinking. So it's really interesting. Right. And I got this from like the Cooper Hewitt Museum. They used to have a bunch of lessons that you could do. And so I thought, well, I really love that activity. I did that with middle school students, but I don't have access to, I don't know how I'm going to get all that light into my classroom now. So no overhead projectors anymore. So what I did was I sort of modified it. And I used Angela Stockman's work with loose parts. And I got a whole bunch of loose parts, which are objects, both natural and manufactured in nature, and you collect them in numbers and you place them out on tables. And the the tangible aspect of the thing helps you connect to the abstract. So it's like, for me, it's a mediator for helping students think metaphorically. And so I knew that the question, well, how do you think, that's a very abstract question. So I wanted them to anchor it somehow into the real world. So I offered these objects, but I also said if you can get there without using the objects, you can find an image or some other, take a picture of something that you think really captures that. And that was the first prompts for my English classes. How do I think? And students did an amazing job, and they created voiceovers of whatever the image was, and then they just recorded audio over top of it. That was the media that they posted. And then underneath that, there were a few questions just to sort of introduce themselves to each other. And then again, it was like you have to comment on your peers' work. And just seeing the variety in the way students approach their thinking, and even if they both chose, it's like a piece of string, because there was lots of string on the desks. Listening to and seeing how somebody else interpreted that versus how you spoke about it, that's just an amazing thing to witness in the classroom. And to have a space where they can talk about that back and forth. There were some threads that had like 5 or 6 people talking in them, and thinking about their thinking, right? Which is, in the end, we want that kind of metacognition. And here I am at the beginning of the year starting with the end in mind. Go figure.
I mean, Gary's Brene Browning his classroom, right? He is creating a culture of trust. He is allowing learners to share out who they are, right? And he is modeling what documentation looks like.
Yeah.
A lot of the skills they're doing in this first activity are so transferable to their jobs, to university, to just being good human beings, right? But what he's also doing is he's differentiating. And that's a term that is overused in education but rarely done. We think about different learning types, but Gary is getting an understanding, and his cohort of like, I don't know, 20 other students in there is getting an understanding of how the minds work of the other students they might be collaborating with. And that's his jump off point for usage
Yeah.
in understanding text, for usage in the life cycle of projects. Like, to me, this is why you connected us, Christian, so many months ago, because you saw in both of us two educators that are obsessed with shifting that power balance and allowing learners to have greater agency and getting them to move from passive to active in their education. The act of documentation and sharing it with others is an active part of being a learner and allows you to actually join in a collective of other learners. That's what I'm so excited about with Unrulr, but also what I'm so excited about listening to Gary's words.
It makes me think of an article that I encountered in Nature magazine, maybe 12 years ago at this point. And the statistic in the article was that over 90% of what we learn is socially mediated. It's not direct instruction. It's not the information that's transmitted through text or image. It's watching someone else or a group of other people. And on a certain level, that makes sense. We're primates, right? We're very kind of socially wired creatures. And I think, again, if Unrulr did nothing other than give us access to watching other people learn and figuring out I can do that too, or it's interesting how Gary does it that way, but I'm going to do it this way. And oh, there's 2 or 3 or 4 different ways to do this. That's interesting. But one of the things I find even more powerful, because we're talking about middle schoolers and high schoolers, is the brain at that stage is so hungry for social connection, for peer-to-peer connection, that it's almost like Unrulr supercharges and enables this instinct that we have that's biological, biosocial, and creates a space in which we can enact those peer-to-peer learning experiences that often they want to happen in the classroom, but they don't, because the classroom just isn't set up to make that possible. And I think of part of what goes on with Unrulr as purpose driving, community driving, trust driving this kind of social. Again, it's like a supercharging of the learning experience, and that just seems like a really positive feedback loop that happens. I'm also curious whether Gary and Aaron, whether you've seen any strengthening of students' ability to move things from their short-term memory to their long-term memory, because the technology does embed metacognition into the work, right? Like you're asking students to reflect on who they are and how they learn. You're asking them to reflect on how other people are learning. And my instinct is, and I'm curious if my instinct is right or if it's off a little bit, that kind of constant act of metacognition is taking a lot of information that would otherwise be clogging up our short-term memory and just sort of slowly chunking it and moving it over into these longer-term memory banks. But does that match your experience, or am I off a little bit?
No, I mean, I think that matches the experience pretty well, because going into the year, I knew. So another thing about my class is that I'm largely gradeless, right? Like, yes, I have to give a grade because I'm in a public school and that's the system that we use. But most of the work goes through feedback loops and reflection loops, and then students are able to choose the pieces that they want to bring in. And I have digital portfolios that they can sort of like gather Unrulr posts, but also other work and pictures of other images of other work that they can put in there. So at the end of the year, I have them create sort of like a slide deck that tells the larger story. And what the best of them did was they pulled Unrulr posts, and they turned those into, unique URLs, which you can do with Unrulr. And those came in as evidence for growth, right? So they get that. They get that what they're looking for is not what does the teacher want me to find, right? It's like, okay, in English class, we talk about what I'm going to help you do is become to think in writerly ways, to engage the class through speaking and learning, or through speaking and listening, and also to understand how to read the world, right? So what I'm not really specific in a rubric that says detailed, these are the exact things that you must have. You've got to talk about yourself and your growth as a reader. And where's the evidence for that? You have to talk about yourself and your growth as a writer and one who thinks in writerly ways. And then the same thing for speaking and listening. And so many of them were pulling in the stories that they had already thought about in Unrulr. But the magic is, and this is true of all reflection, right? You reflected once 4 months ago. Then you take a look at it again 4 months later, and you realize something else, and you see something else. And that,
Totally.
and we just don't, we can talk all we want about, oh yeah, I do reflection in my class, but it takes time, right? There's that time word again. But the return on that investment is beyond anything else. I'm sorry, I don't. English is a very skills-based class. I don't give a lot of um, exams on, like, the details of the Scarlet Letter or something like that. I want to know, growth-wise, the answer to the questions that you've asked, right? Like, who am I? Who are we? And how does English class help me grow within those questions? And Unrulr and being able to use it as evidence on those reflections, it was just amazing.
Um, Yes to everything Gary said. John Nash is at the University of Kentucky. Wrote
Yeah.
a great book on design thinking. John uses Unrulr with his undergrads, but also with his PhD and MBA students. And he called Unrulr a muscle memory tool when it comes to metacognition. His prompts in Unrulr you can have prompts or you can have your learners posting organically. We're all video. And he was asking where they were at in the design thinking process and what they were grappling with. And once a week, at a minimum, his learners in video were responding. And they were building muscle memory. They were getting reps in on what self-implication, what reflection, what did he say to me? He said, I just want learners to learn how they learn and think about how they learn. And John Nash, his students were designing projects for cancer patients at the University of Kentucky's Cancer Center, and had this big presentation to them and to other leaders at the hospital. And he said after using Unrulr, it was like a light bulb had been turned on, where they were able to now speak to what they learned and how they learned, and in some ways for the first time that he'd seen in his students, because they built in that reflection and because they were able to go back and look at those reflections, right? And to answer your question, Christian, I think using the tool creates skills and metacognition. But man, when you can go back and look at those and build journeys from
Yep.
them, and when you have them annotated, like when you're reading an English book and you've got, highlighter everywhere and you've got the legal sticky notes, and you now can go back and look at what you did. That's what Unrulr has become, not just for projects, but for learners, this ability to annotate one's growth and identity, the ability to annotate the iteration of the thing that you're working on. I think that's what's been so beautiful to see in Gary's use case as well.
So it sounds like there's several reasons why a teacher should think about at least playing around with Unrulr. One is, and I'm speaking as someone who doesn't use it in the classroom, but having talked with each of you, this is what I'm gleaning. First, there's just a better return on the investment in terms of how time is experienced. You don't get any more minutes in your day, but the minutes that you have with those students is better used. It sounds like you're getting more out, or the students are getting more out of the time that they're spending in the work that you're asking them to do, and that alone, again, probably makes it worth it. But you're also capturing better evidence of learning, right? So I think teachers often want more time, as you said, Gary, And I think we wish we had better evidence, and we kind of default to low fidelity
Yeah.
assessments because they're easier. There's less friction with them. We may not know what better looks like, but Unrulr allows us to capture better evidence. I think a teacher who takes their craft seriously also wants every single kid in the room to be engaged. And anything that asks kids to bring their identity into that learning experience and to seek to understand and connect with others who are also going through that experience is going to just automatically increase engagement. One thing, though, that I have this theory about, and again, would love to hear you both respond to, is kind of my theory of resources. And so, a lot of times we think about the material resources in the school, certainly money, classroom space, other kinds of facilities, so on and so forth. And I think of those as actually sort of like fifth on the list of resources. And I would put in the number one slot our attention. Where do we place our attention? That's our most precious resource. It is the
100%.
most zero sum of all
Yeah.
resources,
Yeah.
right? Because whatever we're paying attention to means we have to block out the whole rest of the world. Exactly. And the second most important resource, from my point of view, are our relationships with one another. They're a source of just incredible intrinsic value and extrinsic value as well. And then the third most valuable resource is our energy. And a lot of that is physical, but also a good chunk of it is psychological. And for those of us who have this point of view about the world, even spiritual. So your attention, your relationships, and your energy, I think, are your three most precious resources. And then fourth would be time. And then only after that do you get to things like money and buildings and all that other stuff. But if we just look at those first three, my theory is that Unrulr focuses a student's attention when it comes to what they should be learning and paying attention to versus things that probably aren't as important. It focuses that attention in a really helpful and healthy way. It clearly, because of the communal nature of the technology and the way that you use it, fosters and strengthens relationships. And I suspect that the emphasis on purpose and identity kind of is an energy builder rather than an energy drainer. Does that resonate for you guys and how you see it being used and how you're using it?
I mean, I absolutely think so. As you got to that third resource, which is the energy and the of the community itself. It made me think of an article I read a couple of years ago. Um, I think it's called "The Classroom as a Sacred Space." I've referenced it a lot of times. I got it from Will Richardson, and it was from a professor in Colorado. I can't remember, but I mean. It, when I want what I want from students in my classroom is to treat the space and what goes on in that space it as a sacred space, right? And what makes something sacred is that we all come and gather there for something that is larger than ourselves, right? And if you're not going to if you're going to have if you're going to have students lined up in rows and you're just going to treat them as monadic thinkers, you're not going to create a sacred space. So, any chance I get to engage students in talking to each other, in um, opening up their minds to here's what I'm thinking and here's what I created, is that is sacred time. Now, in the past, I've done that by hanging things all over the wall, and I still do that. Obviously, I want people to see things and not just have to be able to look at it digitally. But when I can break down the walls from one classroom to the next classroom and bring everyone into that space and
Preach, Gary.
realize that, yeah, and realize that everyone is engaged in the same thing, but we're doing it differently. We're experiencing the world differently. Like how magical is that? Because we know that in our world, in our little corner of the world, we have a ton of problems with understanding how other people see the world. And maybe that's just human nature, right? But so if there's a tool that helps me to understand somebody else better because I can see and hear what they're doing and how they're thinking, that opens a world of possibilities for me to answer the questions of, what matters to us and what are we going to do about it. So yeah, I totally agree with that. I mean, sure, there's the first thing and the second thing, but for me, that third thing, the sacred space and the energy in a classroom, that's what differentiates my classroom from other people. I'm not the best teacher in the world of English. I've never thought I was. There are many people I would, say, "Wow, you're an awesome English teacher." But I do create experiences and spaces that allow students to engage with information and with learning, I guess I would say, in ways that they haven't done before.
What's the movie with Robin Williams? He's in like a East Coast prep school. Um,
Dead Poets
Dead Poet
Society.
Society. So like
Yeah.
he created a protocol and culture in his classroom that is similar to what Gary has created, similar to what Pua Lincoln, amazing PBL teacher in Hawaii, who's my mentor, created as well. And Unrulr's founder is Native Hawaiian, Will Rapun,
Yep.
and he created Unrulr in the lens of his culture, the power of storytelling, the power of belonging, the ability for learning communities to take their competencies and have them be tags within the tool. Every time a learner is posting, they're tagging that post with the portrait of a graduate
Yep.
or the competency of a classroom, right? For him, it was about localizing assessment, not just taking D school standards on design thinking, or not just using, Colorado's CTE standards or, whatever state you're in, right? But allowing your learners to also have say over what they're being kind of tagged in, assessed in. What's been remarkable about remarkable about its usage is the sense of belonging that we've seen come from many of the learners that are using the tool, where their work is being viewed and celebrated, questioned by others, where for many for the first time, because Unrulr is a multimodal multimedia tool, they're demonstrating learning in a way that feels authentic via video
Hmm.
or audio where they've never been able to display it before. That's been like why I love this job. And that's been why I feel so strongly in trying to get the tool into great learning communities. Unrulr has also become a policy tool. Gary, I don't know about you, but I always had imposter syndrome teaching entrepreneurship or
Yeah.
teaching deeper learning or whatever the buzzword is, right? PBL in a school that mostly wasn't like that,
Right.
right? And the word that was always used against me was rigor. Where is the rigor in your experience? And man, there was so much rigor. There was so much incredible process. And Unrulr, why I came to Unrulr is because it was a documentation of that rigor. It proved the efficacy of the program. And in independent schools and public schools, we see these kind of, Christian, I'm sure you've seen it a lot too, these schools within schools, right? The maker
Hmm.
space where learners have greater agency, right? And the people that run those programs want to grow that. They want it to not just be in a tiny pocket, but they want it to be a part of a larger part of the school and institution. And so I think of our work as policy work, as evidence, as transparency work within learning communities too.
I love this conversation, and I could go down a rabbit hole. I want to bring us back to something really super concrete, and then I want to end on a question for each of you. But in terms of the super concrete, um, Gary, I've heard Aaron say that Unrulr is a tool for learner-led documentation. So for the average teacher who's going to watch this video or listen to this podcast, and they hear that phrase, learner-led documentation, that sounds interesting, but what does it mean exactly? How would you explain it?
Well, I mean, at first, I think I would say that I have to get my students into the space of what it means to be a learner because most of them have spent the majority of their life thinking of themselves as students. And while I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive, I think that the role of student can drown out what it means to be a learner in schools. So, what learner led documentation means is we're doing a whole bunch of work, and I need to know from you, student A or learner A, um, where are you in the process? What do you feel you've grown into, and where do you need help from me, right? So in one sense, you can sort of use it as like a scrum meeting of sorts, right? Where you're just saying, as a learner, here's where I've grown, here's here's the things that I've accomplished, and here's something I need from you. And because they're in charge of choosing those things, that allows me as the teacher to sort of like understand better where all my students are and gets what, sort of like that surface level pole of student learning. And then it helps me be a better teacher. It helps me target things. It helps me personalize. And in the end, that's what we want. So for learner-led documentation, once they're doing that, then the classroom becomes learning centered because then I can better serve my students individually.
Yeah, I think it's giving them the time to reflect, and it's giving them the time to pause, right? We don't pause enough in learning because we're so fixated on moving on to the next task. And so if we commune with each other, if we look at each other's work, if we're able to understand new concepts because we see that documentation, that's a shift in a classroom.
And I think it's worth pointing out that yes, there are some buzzwordy things around project-based learning or mastery-based learning and so on and so forth. And at the same time, those of us who pay attention to where the hockey puck is going know that the Carnegie Foundation is working to change the seat time model. And, once that shift happens at the higher ed level, it will automatically flip the switch for those K-12 schools that haven't already moved in this direction. And so having a tool that makes learner-led documentation easy, almost intuitive, and community-oriented will really smooth the pathway for, again, where I believe the hockey puck is going on that front. The last thing I would love to hear you guys respond to is I think what I see as kind of a primary, maybe the primary purpose of Unrulr for a teacher who's out there, again, watching or listening this. And there's multiple reasons, I can easily picture, a teacher saying, well, look, I'm worried about low fidelity assessments. So, you got to help me to assess my students more authentically, but easily without losing rigor. I think Unrulr does that. I could see another teacher saying, I'm kind of at a loss for how to engage students. So you got to help me to really tap into like their identity, their sense of meaning, their sense of purpose. Again, I think Unrulr absolutely does that. And we've talked about that. The thing though, that feels to me like the greatest use case for Unrulr is really about worries that I think a lot of teachers have. I know it's a worry I have. I have a 15-year-old son who just finished his first year of high school. And I think about what is life going to be like for him when he graduates from high school, when he graduates from college, so 4, 8 years out. But then I think, I'm not going to be here forever. What is his life? How is he going to navigate this world 30, 40, 50 years from now? And I think the best teachers are always thinking about how am I contributing my little piece to how these students are going to navigate the rest of their lives, not just the next several years. And it seems to me that in a world that's more chaotic, that's changing more quickly, that Unrulr gives them really tools for a life's journey. And I'm just curious if that resonates for you and what you would add or say differently.
Aaron, why don't you go first on this one?
I have a healthy skepticism of ed tech, borderline hatred of ed tech. And now I find myself working and I say, we're a learning startup, but I'm in education technology. And I've really struggled with ed tech because it's overpromised and underdelivered. At the end of the day, Unrulr will not create community. You will create community with your students. it is a vehicle to amplify that. It is a vehicle to document it, right? I think the power of the tool is that we are telling learners that their identities and their reflections are worthy of being shared, right? That's what's fundamentally powerful about the tool, that we are giving time for them to share those with others, I think is a really powerful component of Unrulr. And I think, I have a 10-year-old and 6-year-old, very different children. Um, it's about capacity building. I can't hold their hands their entire lives, right? And I need them to be teachers of themselves. And what's been beautiful about watching Unrulr be used in communities is it's become that confidence booster for many learners. It's become something that creates a portfolio of process, not just product, and allows them to share out, sometimes joyously and not joyously, right? The peaks and valleys of their educational experience. I think for me, it's that shift from passive to active that determines so much of our success in relationships, in how we show up for each other, and in our professional lives and our academic lives. And if the tool I work on, the tool we all work on, can be a vehicle, to shift learners to active and to give them a sense of confidence and belonging, then what a joyous opportunity.
And I would add that to your question is, how is it giving tools to navigate a future that is, volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, right? And I think it's actually in the power of the tool to help students reflect, right? We've talked really about two main things here: community and reflection. And as a writer, reflection was always part of the process for me. It's always part of my learning process. Getting more and more students to understand the importance of reflection is something that Unrulr has helped me to do. And the reason it's so important is because we look back in order to move forward, right? We assess our history and where we've been and how we got to who we are now in order to project ourselves into the future. So I mean, I love talking about reflection because it allows me to, like, break down these discrete notions of past, present, and future, which are, wonderful for us to think about in terms of, living our lives in a very orderly way, but it's not how time works, right? Those are constructs. So if I can say who I am now is as much about who I was 6 months ago when I made that project, and how I saw myself 6 months in the future at that point, that just collapses time, and it gives people a better, I think it in a sense, it creates a sense of awe for what it means to be a human being, and that Unruler makes it so much easier for students to find things that were meaningful to them, but also meaningful to other people in the community. We learn from other people's reflections as well. And that allows me to assess the waters ahead of me and to figure out, how I'm going to set my rudder and which way, the winds are blowing, and allows me to enter into those unknown waters with more confidence. I'm all about that. Absolutely. And Unruler has helped.
There are a lot of, I've got 3 pages of notes in front of me from this conversation. So there's a lot of takeaways. But the three biggest takeaways for me are, first, the return on investment as a teacher for this tool. The returns on investment are huge because they're plural. You get a better use of time. You get better evidence from students. You get better engagement from and with students. And most of all, because I think it's the thing that we as educators truly care about, we see better growth in
Yeah.
students and in communities. Those four dimensions of return on investment to me are kind of magical. The second thing is Gary, what you said at some point during this conversation about the shift from students to learners. I think there are teachers out there who they're just they're just trying to put grades in a grade book, right? They have kids in a classroom. But I don't think that's most teachers. I think most teachers don't really want to just put grades in a grade book. And I think most teachers don't really just want to have students. They want learners. And this is a tool that makes it really easy for a teacher to move kids from being students to being learners. And my third takeaway, and this conversation that we're having right now at the end of this interview, is that Unrulr is a mechanism for helping us all, teachers and students, all of us learners, to be more human, to understand ourselves as humans more deeply and intimately, and to understand our community members as humans more deeply and intimately. And if that's not part of the purpose of education, then I don't know what is. So I want to say thank you to you guys for sharing so many great insights. Looking forward to sharing this with the wider Middle States network and community. And hopefully you'll hear from a lot of them.
Great.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Christian.
Thank you so much for this.